This? This is where we're searching for gems? Spike asked as he dropped the handle to his wagon. Before him was a large pond, easily big enough to swim around in, and water so clear he could nearly see the bottom. A small waterfall fed into it from the far side, filling the clearing with a dull roar that he had to speak up to make himself heard. Beside him, a small, feminine hand clasped his. "Yep, this is the place," Sweetie said, her voice as squeaky as it had ever been. She was wearing a cute butter-yellow camisole that her sister had made for her over a simple pair of old jean shorts, the likes of which she had most likely borrowed from Apple Bloom, as Rarity would never let her wear such coltish clothing. They were cinched by a slick white belt, as they were a few sizes too big for the petite filly. "The girls and I found a really pretty sapphire in the water here yesterday while we were swimming. There must be more around here somewhere. Rarity will be so happy if I bring her more." "But why did I have to come?" he asked, but Sweetie was already dragging him around the perimeter of the pond, where a tiny babbling stream came into view. She began tugging off her shoes and socks, tossing them over by the wagon. Her mint green eyes were sparkling with excitement when she looked up at him. "Because Rarity always says that she'd never go gem hunting without you. So come on, maybe I can get a gem hunting cutie mark," she shouted. "Haven't you already tried gem hunting?" he deadpanned. Her eyes widened as she blushed. "Oh, yeah." He slapped a hand on his forehead. It was going to be a long day. 4 hours later, Spike flopped down onto the ground beside the pond. He wasn't surprised that they hadn't found anything, especially when Sweetie admitted that she didn't know that Rarity had a spell that helped her find gems. Despite that, the afternoon hadn't been a complete bust. Having never spent so much time with Sweetie Belle on her own, Spike was surprised to find she was a lot of fun. Her constant good mood was infectious, quickly overcoming Spike's reluctance towards the fruitless work, as well as her good humor, easily getting several laughing fits out of him as they talked and joked about their friends. She even broke out into songs occasionally, belting out the latest pop tunes she had heard on the radio before remembering he was there and falling into an embarrassed silence. Overhead, what had once been a sunny summer day had turned gray and overcast. Spike knew from Twilight's research that the weather in Everfree, lacking the guiding touch of the Pegasi, could change in a heartbeat. Knowing he didn't want to be stuck out in the rain, he groaned and pushed himself back into a sitting position. Sweetie Belle had fallen next to him, her top flipping up and revealing the white fur of her trim belly. Her eyes were closed, basking in the feeling of the soft grass beneath them after being on her hooves for so long. As though feeling his gaze on her, she cracked open an eye, causing him to quickly look away from her body. "We should probably get going if we don't want to get stuck in the rain," he said, climbing up to his feet. Reaching out with a hand, he helped her to her hooves. Just as he did, a giant raindrop pelted the spine on the top of his head. Oh, great. "Over here, I think I see a cave," he shouted, hoping that she heard him. He ducked inside, bowing his head slightly so that it didn't scrape the roof. A moment later she jumped in beside him. The wild weather had stayed true to its name, and the slight drizzle had turned into an outright downpour in the blink of an eye. They were still at least half an hour's walk away from Ponyville, and Spike had no intention of walking through it in the freezing rain. They would just have to wait for it to subside. Hopefully, it wouldn't take long. As a shiver passed through him, he cast about for anything he could use to build a fire. The cave was tiny, but he managed to find several mostly dry sticks towards the mouth. Dumping them in the center, he set about lighting them, for once very grateful to be a dragon. Soon enough he had, well, not exactly a roaring fire, but it was better than nothing. Pulling the wagon over, he parked it directly over the flame, shucking off his shirt and his shorts. He laid them out into the wagon, which was beginning to heat up. As small as the flame was, the metal should heat up without hurting any of the other parts, hopefully drying out his clothes before the rain stopped. Frustratingly, he found his boxers were just as soaked as the rest of his clothes, but he sure wasn't about to take those off. Taking a deep breath, as though to let loose more fire, he instead held it in his lungs. The heat began to build up, slowly spreading out in his chest. Eventually he felt the numbing cold begin to dissipate from his fingers and toes. Finally, taking a seat next to the fire, he noticed that Sweetie Belle was still sitting off by herself. Her eyes were locked onto the cave wall before her, though the crimson blush across her face betrayed where her gaze had been. Rarity would be mad if she knew about this, she said, her voice forcefully even. Spike chuckled. I'm cold-blooded. Twilight says being cold for too long could make me really sick. If you want to sit in those wet clothes, be my guest. But you should at least sit over here by the fire. I don't want Rarity getting pissed at me when you get sick, he said, smirking. She looked at him, opened her mouth, closed it, and looked away from him again. Finally, she stood and took a seat next to the fire, still refusing to look at him. Now, in the light, he could see the violent shivers racking her body. It dawned on him that being covered in fur instead of relatively waterproof scales must suck, and he realized that between that and her clothes, she was never going to be able to warm up without a much bigger fire, or at least something else warm. An idea struck him, and he couldn't help but blush at the thought. You know, your fur's soaked. This dinky fire will never dry you off. Come here, I have an idea, he said, turning his head in her direction, but not looking directly at her. He patted the ground next to him, and after she thought it over for a moment, she scooted over until he could feel her coat on his sides. Wrapping an arm around her shoulder, he focused his breath. He focused his breath again until he felt the heat building. She cooed and leaned into him. Wow, you're so warm, she said, laying her head onto his scaly shoulders. Dragonfire has more than one use, he said, laughing as he exhaled acrid smoke from his nostrils. She coughed and waved away with a hand. After several minutes of sitting in silence, Sweetie shifted, trying to push herself further into Spike's embrace. She noticed that she was still shivering. My clothes aren't drying. Can you warm up any more? She asked. He shook his head. I can't really put out any more than this, he said. Look, you're never going to get warm up wearing those clothes. Why not put them in the wagon with mine? What? She yelped, shoving him away. I couldn't do that. Rarity would be pissed. Well, I won't tell her if you don't. But I can't. She trailed off, mumbling to herself and blushing furiously. She hugged her knees to her chest and laid her head on top. She grumbled something that he couldn't hear past her legs. "What was that?" he asked. Not exactly, wearing anything underneath," she said, now just loud enough for him to hear. As the weight of what she said hit him, he couldn't help but glance at what she was wearing, as though expecting to now see that she indeed didn't have anything on underneath. She blushed again and looked away from him. Coming to decision, he stood suddenly, startling the filly next to him. Before his bravado left him, he grabbed the waistband of his boxers and in a single motion tugged them off, tossing them onto the wagon with the rest of his clothes. A high-pitched squeak sounded next to him, much like the one that left his lips as his bare scales hit the cold stone floor. After the initial shock wore off, he glanced back to Sweetie, who was now hiding her face behind her hands. "There, at least now you won't be alone," he said, trying to sound more confident than he was. She sat there, unmoving and unspeaking, so long that he worried if he had broken her. He poked her slightly in the shoulder, to which she let out another squeak. After a few more minutes of shivering, she spoke up, all the while hiding her face. You can't look okay?" she asked. "You got a nice look." "Spike." All right," he said, turning around. The sound of wet clothes slapping onto the wagon reached him, and he found himself oddly flustered. He felt his heartbeat picking up and his face flushing while he waited. His breath caught as he heard the quiet click-clack of footsteps inches behind him. But another noise confused him. He couldn't place what it was. "Okay, you can turn around now." Rather than standing behind him, she had taken a seat between him and the fire, still hugging her knees to her chest as she had before. She had her back to him, and he couldn't help but let his gaze go down her body. He knew that she was skinny, but he could really appreciate it now. Her slender shoulders, her trim waist, even her petite rear that her fluffy tail couldn't quite hide, despite her efforts. Her little ahem made him realize he was staring. "Could you warm me up?" she asked. Scrambling to move quickly, he sat himself next to her, wrapping his long legs around her. She leaned back, her silken coat tickling the sensitive scale on his chest. He rested his chin on her shoulder, their cheeks meeting, the sweet smell of her rose shampoo filling his senses. He couldn't help but glance down, but was disappointed to see her arms clamped tightly around her chest. As he resumed his fire breathing, he could feel the fur on his stomach slowly drying and her trembles subsiding. He kept at it for a while, the pouring of the rain outside the only noise in the cave. After a while, her shivers quit entirely. "Spike, I was wondering something," she said. He hummed rather than saying anything. "Do you like my sister?" He would have spit if he had any. He would have spit had he been drinking anything. Instead, he choked, sputtering as he tried to think of anything to say. "But how? I think half the town knows Spike," she said, giggling, though it didn't sound like she actually found it funny. He didn't know what to tell her. He had only ever told Twilight about his crush on Rarity. Now Sweetie knew. He liked Sweetie plenty, but he hadn't but he wasn't sure he wanted to talk about his crush on her older sister with her. Then again, they were both currently naked, clinging to each other for warmth while waiting for the downpour outside to wear out. They were pretty far past embarrassed at this point. What more could it hurt? Well, yeah, I guess I kinda do. Yeah, kinda. Or not. I don't know. It doesn't really matter anyway, does it? This time, he gave his own mirthless laugh. What does that mean? She asked, turning so that he could see her face. He sighed into her shoulder. I've liked Rarity since Twilight and I first moved to Ponyville. She just doesn't feel the same way, and I'm tired of being turned down. He could feel her stare for several moments, until she sighed and turned away from him. She leaned forward, moving her arm from her chest and hugging her legs again. Yeah, I know how you feel, she said, her body slumping. Any notion of checking her out again fled his mind when he saw how sad she looked. An idle thought passed his mind, a misplaced notion, a realization dawned on him. He placed his hand on her shoulder, gently rubbing his blunt claws into her fur, working the tense muscles out. Why don't you tell me about him? He asked as he worked. He's a great guy, she said. He's really smart, and he's really nice. He can always make me laugh, and though I wish he'd hang out with me and the girls more often. He's usually too busy with his other older friends. Not to mention he's really cute. He sounds like a great guy. You should introduce me to him one day, he said, brushing her mane out of her face and pushing it over her shoulder. Their eyes met as their face inched closer. You already know him, she trailed off as their lips met. Spike couldn't believe what was happening. He had never kissed a girl before, though he had thought of it with Rarity. Sweetie's lips were softer than he had ever imagined, her breath coming in short, hot bursts upon his face. Her eyes remained clenched shut as she pressed against him. He opened his mouth, allowing his tongue to slip out and brush against her lips. She reciprocated in kind, and they began exploring each other. Her mouth was hot, her flat teeth foreign to him. Meanwhile, her tongue, wide and flat, ran along his fangs, testing the sharp points as she flicked over them. The massage he was giving her, long forgotten, he moved his hand to the back of her head, pulling her closer, trying to give him greater access. Hers, meanwhile, found the side of his face, gently caressing his cheeks and the green fin there. Just as he was getting into it, her hand suddenly pushed him away. Ow! What was that for? He asked after regaining his balance. I can feel your... She trailed off, pointing down, looking mortified. It struck him then what she was getting at. He could feel the finely brushed hair of her tail around him, the soft flesh of her rump pressed so close to his body. Throughout their little make-out session, he hadn't even noticed himself getting so aroused. He clasped the hand to himself, trying vainly to hide his modesty. Sorry about that, he said, scratching the spine on his back of his head. Can't blame me for getting a little in the mood, kissing such a pretty filly. She placed a hand upon his. Can I see it? She asked, briefly meeting his eyes. "What? Please? I've never seen a colt down there before," she pleaded, giving him her best puppy dog eyes. Even if he had ever wanted to say no, he really wouldn't have been able to do so after that. He allowed her to move his hands, exposing his very erect member. Her eyes widened in shock, and she sat there in silence staring. After several agonizing moments, she reached out, her finger inching closer to his flesh. When her fingers finally connected, he let out a gasp. A jolt of pleasure ran down his leg, and a shiver ran down his spine. Being a hormone-riddled teen, it was hardly the first time he had ever touched down there, but it was the first time somebody else had done it. Her hands were shaking as she gently traced the hard spire. Being a dragon, it was vastly different from anything a pony could be familiar with. Its flesh was a vibrant green, matching the soft scales of his stomach and chest. It was covered in what looked like large, rounded scales made of soft, rubbery skin, and topped up by a pointy head. Her fingertips traced it gently from base to tip, drawing another shudder out of him. "Oh, that feels good," he said, breathless. At his words, Sweetie tore her gaze from his pelvis, a determined expression overcoming her. She swiveled around so that she was facing him for the first time. She sat up on her knees, still between his legs, and dropped the hand from her chest to join the other. She began tracing the ridges and barbs with both hands as he finally got a look at her body. He had thought that Sweetie's chest was flat, the loose-fitting clothing she normally wore hiding the tiny swelling nubs beginning to grow in. Her coat was as white there as it was anywhere else on her body, ending in the light pink flesh of her nipples poking through. The sensations he was feeling skyrocketed as she stopped her tracing and began pumping up and down, pleasure flooding his brains. His breath quickened and his heart began to race at the feeling. It was amazing, far better than anything he had done himself. He gestured for her to move closer, placing his hands on her knee, gently prying them apart. She hesitated only slightly, her own arousal overcoming her doubts. As his gaze fell upon her crotch, he felt his mouth fall open. It was the first filly he had seen naked, and for the first time, it wasn't bad. A fresh burst of pleasure gripped him as he traced the small slit with his eyes. It was puffy, the flesh visible through her coat flushed. A tiny puddle had formed under her, and as he watched another drop fell from her slightly parted lips, he knew it wasn't water. He reached out with one hand, and as his claws touched her skin, she let out a breath he hadn't noticed she was holding. Lightly, he traced the skin either side of her slit, relishing the feeling of her skin, of her coat, of the moisture steadily leaking out. When he felt his fingers were sufficiently wet, he placed his pinky at the small opening, pressing slightly. She gasped as his blunt claw sunk in ever so slightly. It was searing to the touch, and even with so little inside, he could feel her walls moving, grasping at his fingers, trying vainly to pull him in. "Please," she moaned, removing her hands from their ministrations and grasping his shoulders. He couldn't help but groan in frustration at the sudden cold. But suddenly she was straddling her lap, her hands replaced by the feeling of her soft rump against him, her dock tickling his tip. "Can we please?" she asked. He knew what she was asking for. He didn't even need to think about it. He was trapped in the haze of lust and the sound of her breathless panting. His knob was all she needed. She lifted herself, hovering over him until her lips finally contracted his tip. They both shuddered at the sensation. Spike's hands jumped to her hips to help guide her. Adjusting herself slightly, she began to descend. Inch by agonizing inch, his penis was enveloped by her silken walls. Quickly, her descent was met with resistance, but with a little effort, she pushed herself past it. Falling suddenly the rest of the way, she let out a pained yelp as their hips met. "Ow, ow, that really hurts!" she cried, tears barely visible past her clamped eyes. She buried her face into his shoulders and wrapped her arms around his neck. Having heard before about the first time hurting, Spike whispered reassurance in her ear and rubbed her back until her whimpers subsided, all the while fighting to quell the mad desire to thrust his hips into her velvet embrace. "Are you ready?" he asked as she calmed. She nodded, her head still pressed into his neck. "I'll be gentle, okay?" With that, he began rocking his hip back and forth. Whatever pleasure he had gotten from her hands was nothing compared to this. Pure ecstasy filled his head, and he had to stop himself from sinking his fangs into her shoulders. If he had had more of his wits about him, he might have guessed that it was a natural dragon reaction, but his mind wasn't capable of coherent thought. He knew just enough to realize that it wouldn't be appreciated, at least. Almost immediately, he felt Sweetie's entire body tense. She let out a shuddering sigh as a mess of fluids gushed across his thigh. Growing more daring, he decided to push things. He removed his hands from her hips, moving one to her left breast and kneading the soft flesh against his palm. The soft scales were rubbing against the exposed skin. After a moment, he took the tiny spot of pink flesh between his claws, tweaking and twisting gently and pulling slightly. The other hand he moved to her tail, wrapping the pink and purple thing around his fingers, and gave it a firm tug. It was a trick that one of the colts in town told him, and it seemed to be doing the trick. She sucked in a large breath, her entire body quivering. After she recovered, she began to bounce upon his laps. The effect was immediate, the wet friction quickly overwhelming him, drawing the inexperienced Drake close to his peak. I can't hold it much longer," he said between pants. "Not inside," she gasps. He held out for a few more bounces as he pulled out. Unable to stop, he thrust forward, his members coming to rest just under her tail as he came. He let out a loud groan as ropes after rope of thick dragon cum shot onto her rump and tail. Only a few spurts managing to make it to the stone floor beneath them. The feeling of his rich penis rubbing against her slit brought her to another climax as well. Another gush of fluids running down his body as her high-pitched squeal filled their small shelter. Spike leaned back against the rock wall, Sweetie slumping down on top of him as he began resuming his fire breathing to keep her warm. Several minutes passed as they sat there enjoying the sounds of their labored breathing and the feeling of their chests moving against one another. He had been staring at the mouth of the cave for a few minutes before he realized the rain had stopped. He gently shook the filly snoozing atop of him and pointed outside. In silence, they began to put their now mostly dry clothing back on. As they stepped outside, Spike with his wagon in tow, Sweetie grasped his hand, and together they began to make their way to Ponyville. "Can we come back out here again sometimes?" she asked shyly, He took his hand out of hers and threw it round her shoulder, smirking. He gave her a quick peck on her forehead, just next to her horn. "I would like that."